and then oppose that to a wilderness area. The wilderness areas really started with the Wilderness Act in 1964. Now remember, the original idea back at the beginning was to have all of our national parks be wilderness areas, but as time went, we went more with the conservation idea. So the wilderness area goes back to the idea of preservation. Wilderness areas are not touched. They are completely undeveloped, untouched land. Now these are all federally managed land. So the government of the whole country, the whole United States, or a whole other country manages this land. There are non-federal lands that are protected, and these are things like land trusts. Land trusts are typically owned by a state or a large conservancy, very wealthy person, that it basically sets up their own little national park, their own little area that is preserved. They would have jurisdiction over whether it would be a park or a refuge or a wilderness area, how much people could go in and disrupt the land. Internationally, some other things that we see listed here: paper parks, reserves, heritage sites. Let's go through these. Paper parks, essentially, just like their title, they're a park on paper, but in reality, there's no regulation. Okay? Especially in some developing nations, they're trying to set these ideas up, but they just have no way to really regulate the system. Biosphere reserves, I think the easiest way to understand these is by drawing a picture. Biosphere reserves set up perimeters. So there's a core area where nothing can be touched, where it's completely preserved. And then they set up a buffer area around that, where there's some conservation and some preservation. And then at the outer area is kind of a transitional area, back to reality, where you have conservation. So biosphere reserves really target one area to preserve it, and use conservation in the areas going out. World Heritage Sites try to preserve sites that are really important to a specific group of people. Recently, a very large area around Hawaii was set up as a World Heritage Site for the native people there. One of the largest national parks, essentially. It's a World Heritage Site, but we would look at it as a national park in the world because it takes up a lot of the area of the ocean around Hawaii as well. Transboundary parks, boundary between countries. So transboundary parks are parks that actually go between two different countries. And sometimes transboundary parks become peace parks. If they're between two countries that really are having a hard time getting along, transboundary parks are sometimes ways to broker a peace. Now, there are transboundary parks between the United States and Canada. I wouldn't call those peace parks. They're just transboundary parks. They're run and managed by multiple governments. But peace parks, especially in between some Asian countries, can be used to really broker a peace and have an area where there won't be any fighting. Not everybody wants land to be set aside. We think of this and we think of these great reasons why we want land to be set aside. Preserving land gives us some scenic features. It gives us areas for recreation. It provides areas for ecotourism. Biophilia provides that connection that humans feel, that special feeling humans feel, the connection with the land. It provides ecosystem services. It provides protection of biodiversity. You have this long list of reasons why these protected areas are so important. But not everybody agrees. A lot of people that live in Western states advocate for what's called a wise use movement. If you think about this, by the time all of these national parks are being set up and people were really starting into this movement, some of the Western states were just being developed by the time this was all coming into play. So if you lived in Illinois or New York or Mississippi, in areas where people had settled many, many hundreds of years, several hundred years at this point, you were okay with the idea of preserving some of the natural land because you'd seen how much had been degraded around you. But if you've just gotten out to the West and you've gone out in a covered wagon and you're settling and you want the chance to build your farm and build your industry, you might not like the idea of preserving the land. The government also, by the time we got out west, was recognizing how important it was to preserve, and some of the Western states are almost all reserve land. Bet you didn't know, unless you really caught that little line in your textbook, that about 80% of Nevada is federally owned. 80% of the state is in national parks and refuges and wilderness areas. So a lot of people in the western states are pushing for wise use movements, that these federal lands should be released and be used more for their resources, just like the land's been used in all the eastern states. Another group of people that really don't always agree with land set-asides are Native Americans. And I think this would be true in other countries for any Native population. Now, it seems like a juxtaposition because we always think about the Native Americans wanting to live and be one with the land. And that's still true, but they want to have control over it. They don't want the government to own the land and then allow them to live there. They want to have control of their own land. So in general, we have that long list of reasons why it's important to create all these different protected areas, but there is some controversy with it. Last topic I would like to talk about is a problem that comes about when we try to preserve land, and that's called habitat fragmentation. It's a problem that occurs, it's a downfall of this land preservation. When we preserve little areas of land, we preserve a little chunk here and a little chunk there and a little chunk down, the next state over, we create what are called edge effects. Edge effects are the idea that we no longer have that primary forest growing everywhere. We've created these little pockets of forest that are left. We see this when we drive around here. We see the little forest preserves every, couple miles in Lake County. You see a little forest preserve. Conditions along the edges of these areas are going to be different than the conditions in the interior. Birds, for example, are very sensitive to this. Some bird species can only survive in the interior of ecosystems. They can't survive along the edges. So we've essentially, by chopping up and preserving all these little areas, have created a lot of edges. This was studied, and we understand this because of what's called island biogeography theory. You do not need to understand a whole bunch about island biogeography theory. You don't need to understand a ton of it, just the basics. That when we study island populations, what we found is that we can estimate the number of populations or number of species that we found on an island based on how big that island is. So on this graph down here, we have larger islands all the way down to some smaller islands. And if you look at the number of species on the island, you're going to have less species in the smaller islands, more species in the larger ones. Okay, so just studies on islands have shown us this. This idea can be translated into the islands that we've essentially created with all of our forests. There's no longer one big forest covering Illinois. There's little pockets of forest that we've saved in forest preserves. We've essentially created little islands of forest. And so what we can translate here, the island theory goes into what we've done, that the bigger the pocket of forest, the more species we would have there. Okay? This is summarized in what's called the SLOS dilemma. SLOS stands for single large or several small. When governments are going in, when local, state, federal governments are going in and making these forest preserves, they need to make a decision. Is it better to have one single large preserve or several smaller preserves? What they found is that it is better to have, based on this island theory, a single large habitat preserved, much better than to have several small ones. Reduces the problems of edge effects, leaves you with higher numbers of species in your preserve. They've also found that you have to leave corridors. You have to leave ways for animals to get from one preserve to the other. If you don't, if you lock these little forest fragments into their own little pieces, you're really going to drop in biodiversity. You're really going to change the ecosystem. So what started as a good idea, creating all these little preserves and all these little, lake forest preserves in Lake County. We have tons of them. We've really started to see some of the issues come about because we don't want several small preserves. We want one large preserve, as big as we can get it.